Hello. Welcome back to my channel. In my previous video, I explained the 5 steps of our strategy to solve math word problems. So, we have a math word problem as you can see it behind me. We will use our math word problem strategy to solve our problem. So, we will focus on simple interest. So, we have a simple formula to figure out the simple interest. We will use a letter to represent simple interest, which is I. This formula is used for a loan or an investment. So, I equals PRT. So, P represents principal, which is how much you borrowed from the bank. For example, you ask a bank for a loan of, let's say, $5,000. That is the principal. R is the annual interest rate. So, you will pay interest on that loan. It typically will be in percentage. The rate may be something like 3%. Then T is the time of the loan in years. It can be 1 year after you got the loan, or 5 years or 10 years after you got the loan. So, we will use that formula for our math word problem. So, what does the math word problem say? Laura borrows a total of $22,000 from 2 different banks. Why is Laura getting 2 loans? She wants to establish a new business. Now, one bank charges the equivalent of 4% simple interest, which is the annual interest rate. Then the other bank charges 5.5% in simple interest. Now, if the total interest after 1 year was $910, you want to determine how much was borrowed from each bank. So, we will begin to use our math word problem-solving strategy. So, recall from my previous video, step 1 is with the first step, you want to read the problem carefully. Maybe read the problem twice. Then you want to determine what the problem is asking for. Because this is very important. You cannot just go ahead and start solving the problem, especially if you don't know what the problem is asking for. So, what the problem is asking for typically at the end of the problem. So, we see this at the end of the problem. We need to determine the amount borrowed from each bank. I will go ahead and underline that part. Then set up variables to represent our unknown quantities. So, we have 2 unknown quantities from what the problem is asking us for. We have 2 banks and we have to figure out how much is borrowed from each. We have two unknowns: the amount borrowed from one bank and the amount borrowed from another bank. Now, I will pick X to represent the amount borrowed from the first bank. I will write that down on the board. So, X will represent the amount borrowed from one bank. Now, you might be thinking I might want to use Y to represent the amount borrowed from the other bank. We could do that, but let's make this problem a bit easier. Why is that? We know Laura borrowed a total of $22,000 from two banks. For example, if I borrow $10,000 from one bank, how much would I borrow from the other bank? So, this means the amount borrowed from the other bank will be $12,000. Does that make sense? So, the amount borrowed from the other bank will be $22,000 minus whatever amount you borrowed from the first bank. This is so you can meet that threshold of $22,000. Let me write that down on the board. So, we set up our variables here. Now, let's move on to step 2 of our problem-solving strategy. So, from the previous video, step 2 says, so, maybe we need to make a figure. Or maybe we need to set up a table. Understand that you have to analyze the problem to determine if you should make a figure or a table. For this problem, should we make a figure? No, not really. This is a financial-related problem. Should we make a table? No, because we just have a few simple pieces of information and we already have a formula. Now, let's move on to step 3. So, to remind you of what step 3 involves. Now, we will write our equation. Understand that we already have our formula. But before we set up our equation using our formula, first, write it in English. This will help us to visualize how to set up our equation using math symbols. So, we know the total interest after 1 year is $910. We know that the total interest or I for both loans will be $910. So, here's what we'll do. Let me write this on the board. We know capital I for both loans will be $910. So, that means we have to figure out capital I for each loan separately. Let me write that down. Capital I sub 1 is the simple interest for the first bank. That plus capital I sub 2, which is the simple interest for the second bank. Both added will equal 910. So, we will use PRT. So, using simple English, we will figure out the amount of interest for one bank plus the interest for the other bank. Let me write that all down. So, the interest from one bank plus interest from another bank altogether equals 910. Now, we are ready to use our formula. We have to figure out PRT for each loan. So, let's begin with our first bank. We need to find capital P. What is capital P? That is the principal. So, recall that from our problem, it asks us to find how much each loan is. This means X will represent the principal for the first bank. So, replace capital P with X. Now, next will be RWHCH as rate. So, with the first bank, what is its annual interest rate? It is 4%. So, this is in percentage format. We need to convert it to decimal. So, 4% will be changed to 0.04. Now, next is T and it represents the loan in years. So, recall that the total interest after 1 year. So, we are only calculating simple interest for 1 year. So, T will be 1. So, that's our formula to calculate the interest for the first bank. Now, we have to do the same process for the second bank. We want to figure out capital P for the second bank. Again, P is the amount borrowed from the second bank. So, we know from what we have written here, 22,000 minus X represents the principal for the second bank. Let's go ahead and write that. Now, R is the annual interest rate. For the second bank, it charges 5.5%. Now, convert that to decimal. It will be 0.055. Now, let's do T. Again, it will be 1 because we are only calculating interest after 1 year. Now, we have our equation. We are ready to solve it. Now, 0.04 times 1 is 0.04. 0.055 times 1 is 0.055. Now, we can use our distributive property. We will distribute 0.055 to the two terms here. So, first, 0.055 times 22,000 will give us 1,210. Now, 0.055 times x will be 0.055x. Now, let's focus on the left side. We have x here and x over here. This means we can combine like terms. So, 0.04x minus 0.055x will give us negative 0.015x. Now, we will leave negative 0.015x where it is. We want to move 1,210 to the other side. This means we will subtract 1,210 from both sides. (910 minus 1,210 is minus 300. We are almost there. Now, to get x by itself, we'll divide both sides by minus 0.015. Oftentimes, students make this mistake. They will divide by 0.015. They didn't add the negative part. Recall that we want to remove everything in front of x to leave x only. There shouldn't be a minus sign. Nothing. Just x by itself. So, negative 300 divided by negative 0.015 will give us what? 20,000. Now, most students will say, I found the answer. I'll go ahead and circle it. But wait a minute. First of all, 20,000. What's that? 20,000 shoes? 20,000 cars? 20,000 houses? You need to add units. What is the problem talking about? Money. Recall that the problem asks us to determine the amount borrowed. So, the value for x will have the dollar sign appended to it. So, it'll be $20,000. Now, can I go ahead and circle it? No, wait. The problem asks for the amount borrowed from each bank. which means we only found one amount for one bank. We need to figure out the amount borrowed from the other bank. Now, let's go back to the variables that we had set up. It says up here, let X represent the amount from one bank. So, we know the amount we found was borrowed from the first bank. So, which bank are we talking about for that amount? We are talking about the bank that charges 4% in simple interest. We'll add that information. We added this important note. We want to identify which bank $20,000 were borrowed from. It was borrowed from the bank that charges 4% interest. Now, we need to figure out how much was borrowed from the other bank. Let's go back to our setup here. So, 22,000 minus X. We know X is 20,000. So, 22,000 minus 20,000 gives us 2,000. That is the amount borrowed from the other bank. We know it is $2,000. Now, which bank is this associated with? It is from the other bank that charges 5.5% interest. So, add that as a note. So, that is our answer for our word problem. See how we applied our word problem-solving strategy. We did the 5 steps. We did the first step, which we read the problem carefully and identified what the problem is asking for. Then we set up our variables for our unknown quantities, which is where we set them up here on the board. Then the second step was what we skipped, as we didn't need to draw a figure or a table. Then step 3 was to write an equation. We did first set up a verbal equation in English. We converted it to a mathematical equation. We used our formula up here. Then with step 4, we did solve our equation. We got X equals 20,000. We did not stop there. Then we applied step 5. We had to interpret our answer in the context of the problem. We interpreted that 20,000 is $20,000 borrowed from the first bank that charges 4% interest. Then we had to figure out the amount borrowed from the other bank and interpret that as well. We used our variables set up here. 22,000 minus 20,000 equals 2,000. Then we interpreted what 2,000 means. It means $2,000 borrowed from the other bank that charges simple interest of 5.5%. I know it is a lot of work, but it is good to know how to approach the problem. Using our 5-step problem-solving strategy. Because real-world problems don't have formulas always ready to use. You may have a word problem like the one we had. You have to realize what you don't know and how to set up an equation and solve it. Then interpret the solution. In the next video, we will do another fun math word problem and apply our 5-step problem-solving strategy. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't. Click on the bell to be notified when the next video is posted. See you in the next video. Bye.